Let's talk about the cross dissolve. It's probably the most frequently used transition ever, unless you count the cut as a transition, which I don't, and it looks like this. One video gradually disappears, while the next video gradually appears.
Note that this is completely different from the other type of dissolve found in Photoshop and other programs, where random pixels disappear one by one until the whole image has been replaced. See the difference? We're not talking about the pixely looking one. Anyway, the cross dissolve, also simply known as the dissolve, was first used in 1899 in Georges Méliès's Cinderella to indicate the passage of time and to move from one scene to another. He couldn't do it perfectly. Because of technical film reasons, there's an awkward cut just before the transition starts and just after it ends, but it doesn't matter. This is still a dissolve. And today, 125 years later, we still use the cross dissolve transition to indicate the passage of time and for moving from one scene to another. It's absolutely timeless. Also, the longer the cross dissolve lasts, the more time is being indicated to have passed. Or it can be used to bring extra emphasis to something, like this dramatic quote from a court case. But dissolves are useful for far more than that. For example, when going from a shot that is in motion to another shot that's not in motion, it's sometimes better to use a dissolve instead of a cut. A cut can be more jarring for the viewer in these circumstances. I learned this little trick at BCIT, which is why this example footage is such low resolution. Looking over my own Eclipse videos, I was surprised to see that I still do this. When going from footage to a still graphic, I will often use a cross dissolve. A dissolve is also useful when going from motion to motion, from still to motion, and from still to still. It's also useful when going from A-roll to B-roll, from B-roll to B-roll, from B-roll to A-roll, and even from A-roll to A-roll. And it can be used to make text or graphics appear or disappear, whether they're full frame or smaller than the frame.
Now, that's a lot. That's like everything. And yeah, that's the biggest problem with the cross dissolve. It's a double-edged sword. It's so useful that it's very easy to overuse it. And that will lead to transition fatigue in your audience. But I'll explain that a little bit later. I can only think of a few places to not use a cross dissolve. I will never use it when transitioning from unmoving A-roll footage to that exact same unmoving A-roll footage. I think that just looks incredibly amateur. Remember, a good transition will convey information, but there's nothing to be conveyed here. We're just in the middle of a monologue. The audience doesn't need to be given the implication that time has passed between those two shots. It probably has, but that's completely irrelevant for the content. I also don't usually use it when transitioning from one A-roll shot to a different A-roll shot. I'll either use a cut or some other transition like a push or a wipe. It just feels weird to me to use a dissolve for this. As my career progressed, I also started to shy away from using the cross dissolve when going from B-roll back to A-roll, but I couldn't really tell you why. The cross dissolve is just so dang useful, I still find myself using it in places where I need a transition, but I just can't think of a better one to use. So, let's talk about transition fatigue and how to avoid it. This doesn't apply to the cut, because the cut is not a transition, but that's just my opinion, man. Your audience will feel fatigued or annoyed or bored or some other negative emotion if you use the same damn transition over and over and over and over again. So, don't do that. Unless you want to cause negative emotions, and sometimes you do. I feel like the cross dissolve is actually the most resistant to transition fatigue, but even the cross dissolve has its limits. Let's look at an example. I always edit my videos in multiple passes. I will usually add transitions later in the editing process, after the rough cut, during the fine cut and polishing passes. And I'll just add them as I go, along with whatever other animation and graphics I need to create.
But let's say that your video is almost fully edited and has no transitions at all. You've got a section with a bunch of photos all in a row. You've got A-roll, which was filmed in a few different locations. You've got a bunch of B-roll. You've got a few clips from other videos, some screenshots of websites, and some custom-made graphics. This actually describes my Eclipse Trip episode 2 fairly well, so I'll be using that as our example. Leaving everything as straight cuts is not very visually interesting. So let's say you don't just want to play it safe. You want to use some transitions. The worst thing you could do would be to put cross dissolves on everything. Here, I've actually done that. Let's watch a short segment.
To rent a camper van is approximately
$200 to $300 a day. My script says $170 a day, but these websites were lying to me. That's the price before adding extra mileage, necessary extras, and taxes. Ugh.
So it's not even worth it. That's too expensive.
Did you experience any transition fatigue? Now, you may not have even noticed if I hadn't pointed it out, but it is kind of numbing and monotonous, isn't it? And the longer this goes on, the worse it gets. Now, compare that to the actual finished video, which has a variety of transitions.
To rent a camper van is approximately
$200 to $300 a day. My script says $170 a day, but these websites were lying to me. That's the price before adding extra mileage, necessary extras, and taxes. Ugh.
So it's not even worth it. That's too expensive.
Isn't that just better? And the sound effects really help too. So the point is that instead of doing something like this, you're doing something more like this. You see, you're using a variety of transitions, but in a consistent way. Note that I've never actually written out one of these for my own videos. I always just place down transitions based on pure instinct, but it might help you to make one of these, I don't know. What you're doing is establishing a visual language for each transition, whatever that might be, and then sticking to it. Is this starting to make sense? So, you should maintain the same visual language of transitions within the same video, but you don't have to do the same thing in the next video. You might decide to use some other transition or transitions between photos from now on, or you might switch it up on every single new video. So, the opposite of transition fatigue would be transition overload. That's when the editor uses a different, seemingly random transition between every shot, with little to no rhyme or reason. Like me, you may have been forced to sit through boring PowerPoint presentations where the maker has clearly just discovered the Animations and Transitions tab, and they think this will make their presentation more interesting. But really, it just makes it so much worse.
So, don't do that. The content of a PowerPoint or video is what's actually important. The transitions should be there to support it, not overwhelm it. Overly fancy and complex transitions mostly just distract from good content, which makes the whole video worse overall. Furthermore, even if your content is boring, crazy transitions are still going to make it worse, because all they do is make the boring stuff look even more boring by contrast. In both cases, the wacko crazy transitions are consuming all the attention of your audience. Don't use crazy transitions. Simple is better. For a counterexample, if you carefully watch any Captain Disillusion video, you'll see that he constantly uses a huge variety of transitions. But it's all done so expertly and seamlessly that it's not annoying, it's engaging. So you gotta learn the rules before you break them. Also, I've never edited videos for TikTok or for children, and I know that those kinds of videos can have lots of crazy transitions, so my advice does not necessarily apply to those. You gotta know your audience.
Fade and dip to black. If you dissolve into a matte of pure black, which is often called a fade to black, it usually indicates that even more time has passed than if you simply used a cross dissolve. If you dissolve to and from black, that's called a dip to black. And it's a good general purpose transition. It can be used to separate different parts of your video from one another, such as in these examples. I used a few dips to black in my treehouse video to indicate nighttime. And in my Rubik's Cube video, I used it for transitioning into a quick montage of my week-long canoe trip. Beware of cross-dissolving multiple layers at once. Hey, did you notice this problem in that little example I showed earlier? Let's slow it down. During the 12 frames of this dissolve, you catch a glimpse of some other graphics peeking through. What's up with that? Well, the timeline looks like this. 6 cross dissolves stacked on top of each other. This is not good, because when cross dissolves do not lead into another clip, or when that clip has transparency, it will show things from the layers below. In this case, I actually used this website screenshot twice to fill in the right side of the frame because that was faster than making a light gray matte, and it didn't matter because the duplicate graphics were covered up. But now we can see them during the cross dissolves. Even if I did replace this with a light gray matte, we still have the same problem. This layer is making everything slightly more gray, and all the other layers are also doing their own thing. There are 2 solutions to this. 1, delete these transitions, one at a time because Premiere still doesn't have a command or shortcut for this. Then, nest everything on the left side of the cut. Then move that down and use just one cross dissolve to go to the next shot. That's much better. No more overlapping graphics. Just remember that sometimes you have to extend the final clips to the right a little bit to give enough room for the transition. But if you're extending the clips, you actually don't need to delete the transitions on them after all, because in the timeline you can just not use that part of the nest. But it doesn't matter, because you shouldn't do it this way anyway. It's kind of destructive. I like seeing everything all on the same timeline, and I don't like having to go inside of nests in case I need to change or tweak things later. Like, how am I supposed to line up sound effects without seeing where the clips begin and end? So, a much simpler way to do this, which I do all the time, is to simply move the clip for the next scene above everything else, and just use one dissolve on that. Then, make sure these other clips extend far enough to the right, and you're done. You don't even need to delete those transitions so long as they don't overlap the main transition at all. Though Premiere might still take a bit longer to render this because it does worry about stuff underneath fully opaque layers even when it shouldn't, so you still might want to delete those transitions. Unfortunately, a single-sided cross dissolve like this is going to have the linear compositing problem, which basically means that bright colors will animate in or out far too quickly. This will be fully explained in another dedicated video. Fortunately, Film Impact's free cross dissolve does have a solution. So let's talk about the Film Impact dissolve. This is my #1 most used transition ever. I have it set as my default. It's much better than Premiere Pro's stock cross dissolve because it has easing. This results in smoother, more aesthetically pleasing transitions. The improvement is most noticeable when the transition starts and stops, especially in the darkest and lightest areas. Also, it's completely free. Just sign up for the 30-day trial and you'll get to use this and 3 other Film Impact transitions for free forever. And good news, everyone! Until Adobe fixes the linear color problem, you can use the easing of this transition to mostly remediate it. By default, it's got an ease in and out of 34, but to counteract gamma problems, I've started to use values 50 and 80, with 80 on whatever side that is not connected to another clip. Yes, I know that says 88. Because I really don't want to have to nest the footage on both sides of all my cross-dissolve transitions, which right now is the only other way of getting around this transparency problem. Also, you have options for film, highlight, and lowlight dissolve, but I personally never use them. I don't know, some people love these, but every time I experiment with them, I'm underwhelmed. Maxon Universe does not have a cross dissolve, and FX Factory might have one, but I don't know because it only works on Macintosh and I use a PC, so I won't mention these again. Boris FX Continuum also has a cross dissolve transition with ease controls, which even show up on the program monitor if you click on any of the parameter names. Now, you may have noticed the giant watermark on top of everything. That's because I didn't have a license for these transitions during the several months that I spent experimenting with them. So there will sometimes be watermarks in the example footage, but fear not, everything works exactly the same underneath that watermark. And now that I do have a license, I'll probably go back to recreate some of them just so it's a little easier for you to see stuff. Anyway, the GUI is really cool, but these particular controls aren't very useful. They don't affect transparency. They only affect the color correction parameters from up here, making them essentially useless to me. Bizarrely, changing the sequence settings to composite in linear color has no effect on this transition. But also, it does the worst job with compositing across layers compared to all other dissolve transitions, so it doesn't even matter. Not so with Boris FX Sapphire's S_dissolve. I don't know what voodoo magic they are using, but this transition has the best looking gamma compositing of any dissolve, whether across multiple layers, between the same layer, with or without a black matte background, and all of that with or without linear compositing turned on. And yes, you do even have custom ease controls. So, Sapphire for the win. Here's something else about the cross dissolve, and indeed all transitions. Don't make them too long. My default duration for a cross dissolve is 12 frames on a 30 FPS timeline. That's 0.4 seconds, and I usually don't change it. I've found over the years that this is a pretty good duration for most things. In fact, I've kept it at 12 frames for the last 10 years. With cross dissolves, the viewer usually cannot clearly see what's going on during the transition. So, the worst thing that you can do is make your transitions last longer than the actual content. This is a total noob thing. I've had to sit through far too many slideshows where I'm barely given enough time to actually look at a photo with no transition in the way before the next transition starts and ruins the view. Again, the audience can't enjoy the content if transitions keep getting in the way. Even a good transition, like the cross dissolve, can be misused. So don't make them too long unless you've got a good reason to do so. I've certainly used some long cross dissolves in my time editing, sometimes 2, 3, or even 4 seconds long, but I'll usually only do this if it's more of a thoughtful, slow, or dramatic piece, and or if one of the source videos is relatively simple. Last thing, and very important, if you have already keyframed some kind of Ken Burns motion, a slow zoom or pan, and then you add a transition, like the dissolve, well, now the clips on both sides of that transition are slightly longer because they overlap. And your keyframed motion won't kick in until halfway through the transition. So it'll look stupid when the motion suddenly begins, probably with no easing. I see this mistake all the time. So make sure you go back and extend those keyframes all the way into the transition. You can turn off pin to clip if you want to extend keyframes even farther than that, by the way. That's a little known feature. All right, let's talk about the wipe. You just watched one chapter from a longer transitions tutorial, which you can also watch right now for free from the link below, or just click this little thingy on screen right now. The tutorial covers nearly every useful transition and every transitions vendor. I'll see you there.